Story number 1.
It was a stormy night, the kind where the rain fell in sheets, and the thunder rumbled like a distant warning. The wind howled, causing the branches of the trees outside to thrash violently against the windows. Inside, the old house creaked under the pressure of the storm, each gust of wind seeming to add another layer of mystery to its already eerie atmosphere. Alone in the house, Clara sat by the dimly lit fireplace, wrapped in a thick wool blanket. She had always preferred solitude, finding peace in the quiet moments, but tonight the house seemed different. The stillness felt oppressive, like the walls themselves were watching her. She glanced at the clock. It was well past midnight. The house was silent, except for the occasional crackle from the fire and the relentless pounding of the rain. Clara had recently moved into the house, a large Victorian-style home that had been passed down through her family. Her grandmother, who had lived here until her passing, had often told Clara stories about the house's past, stories that had always intrigued her but also made her uneasy. The house had a history, one that Clara had dismissed as just family lore. But as the storm outside grew fiercer, she couldn't shake the feeling that something in the house was awake. It started with a sound, a faint, soft tapping that echoed from the dark hallway beyond the living room. Clara stiffened, her heart skipping a beat. At first, she thought it might be the house settling, the wind playing tricks on her. But then the tapping came again, this time louder, more distinct. It was coming from upstairs, from the old bedroom at the end of the hall. Clara hesitated. Her eyes darted toward the staircase, her mind racing with thoughts of rational explanations. It had to be the wind, she convinced herself. There was no logical reason for the house to be haunted. But despite her attempts to reassure herself, the hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and a cold shiver ran down her spine. The tapping continued, and Clara could no longer ignore it. Her curiosity got the better of her, and she stood up, the warmth of the fire behind her contrasting sharply with the chill that had settled in her bones. She wrapped her blanket tighter around her shoulders and made her way to the stairs. Each step creaked under her weight, and she winced at the sound, feeling like an intruder in her own home. As she ascended the staircase, the air grew colder, and the tapping grew louder. It was coming from the very end of the hall, where the door to the old bedroom stood slightly ajar. Clara's breath caught in her throat. The room had always felt off to her, a place she avoided even when she was a child. It was as if the room itself carried a weight, a presence that was impossible to ignore. She reached the top of the stairs and hesitated. The hallway stretched before her, bathed in the dim glow of a single light bulb that flickered intermittently. The shadows seemed to move, shifting with every gust of wind that rattled the windows. Clara slowly approached the bedroom door, her pulse quickening. The tapping had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to stretch on forever. With a deep breath, Clara pushed the door open. The room was dark, the only light coming from the storm outside, casting long shadows across the wooden floors. She stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room, searching for any sign of what could have caused the noise. But there was nothing. The room was empty, save for a bed covered in a thick layer of dust and an old rocking chair in the corner. The chair creaked as if moved by an invisible force, and Clara froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She turned slowly, trying to convince herself that it was just the wind, but deep down, she knew it wasn't. The air in the room felt wrong, thick with something unexplainable. She stepped closer to the rocking chair, her footfalls muffled on the carpeted floor. The chair rocked again, more forcefully this time, and Clara stumbled back, her eyes wide with fear. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang, and Clara spun around, her heart nearly stopping in her chest. She tried to open the door, but it was stuck, as if something was holding it from the other side. Panic surged through her, and she began pounding on the door, calling out for help, though she knew no one could hear her in the isolated house. The storm outside was so fierce that it drowned out any sounds that might have carried through the walls. As she struggled with the door, Clara's gaze fell to the mirror on the opposite wall. It was old, its surface tarnished with age, but in the reflection, she saw something that made her blood run cold. In the dim light, she could see the faint outline of a figure standing behind her, just beyond the frame of the mirror. Her breath caught in her throat, and she slowly turned, expecting to find someone standing in the room with her. But there was no one there. The room was empty, save for the rocking chair and the bed. Yet, in the mirror, the figure remained, a shadowy outline of a person with long, dark hair and an expressionless face. Clara's heart raced, her mind struggling to comprehend what she was seeing. She stepped back, her legs trembling beneath her, but no matter how far she moved, the figure stayed in the reflection, always just behind her. A low, guttural whisper filled the air, and Clara's eyes snapped to the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the doorknob. But before she could turn it, the whispering grew louder, more insistent, and she could swear she heard words now, though they were too faint to make out. The figure in the mirror seemed to shift, its outline becoming clearer, more defined. Clara's breath quickened as she backed away from the mirror, her mind racing for an explanation. The whispers continued, growing louder until they were deafening. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went silent. The mirror was empty. The figure was gone. With shaking hands, Clara finally managed to open the door, and she stumbled into the hallway, gasping for air. She didn't stop to look back, not daring to. She fled down the stairs, her heart hammering in her chest. She had to get out of that house. She had to leave before whatever was in that room could find her. The storm outside raged on, but Clara barely noticed. She ran through the house, checking every window, every door, but everything was locked. It was as though the house itself was keeping her inside, trapping her within its walls. Her mind spun with panic, and she wondered if she was losing her grip on reality. She heard the tapping again, louder this time, coming from somewhere deep within the house. It echoed through the dark halls, relentless and mocking. Clara's legs felt weak, but she forced herself to move, to keep going, even as the house seemed to close in around her. The tapping grew louder, more frantic, and then, without warning, it stopped. The silence that followed was thick, oppressive, and Clara could feel it pressing in on her from all sides. She stood frozen, her breath shallow, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But nothing did. It was then that Clara heard the footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps, moving closer and closer. She turned, her eyes wide with terror, but there was no one there. The footsteps continued, growing louder with each passing second, until they were right behind her. Clara spun around, but still there was nothing. She was alone, or was she? A cold hand brushed against her shoulder, and Clara screamed, spinning around to face the darkness. There, standing just inches away from her, was the figure from the mirror. Its face was pale, featureless, a mask of emptiness. Its eyes, dark and hollow, stared at her with a cold, unblinking gaze. Clara tried to move, but her body wouldn't respond. The figure reached out, its cold fingers wrapping around her arm, pulling her closer. The whispering filled her ears once again, the words now clear and unmistakable. "You are not alone." The last thing Clara saw before everything went dark was the figure's face, its lips curling into a twisted smile. Story the end.
Story number 2.
It was a late October evening, one of those nights when the wind howled through the trees and rain lashed against the windows. The kind of night that made every shadow in the room feel a little too close, a little too real. I was sitting alone in my small apartment, curled up on the couch with a blanket, trying to ignore the thunder that rattled the windows. The warm light of the lamp flickered as the storm intensified. I had always loved rainy nights, but tonight there was something different in the air, an unease I couldn't shake. I glanced at the clock, 10:43 p.m., a late hour for a weeknight, and I had just finished a long day at work. My roommates were both away for the weekend, visiting their families. Normally, I relished the peace and quiet of being alone, but tonight I couldn't quite ignore the gnawing feeling in the pit of my stomach. I shrugged it off, telling myself that it was just the weather playing tricks on my mind. The apartment itself was nothing fancy. It was small, tucked away in an old building on the outskirts of town. The creaky floorboards and the faded wallpaper added character, but they also gave the place a certain eerie charm. My mind wandered as I thought about the history of the building. The landlord, Mr. Hargrove, had never mentioned much about its past when I moved in. He was an odd man, old and thin, always dressed in dark, worn-out clothes. I had asked him about the building once, and his response had been vague, almost uncomfortable. Something about the way he avoided eye contact made me think he knew more than he let on. I dismissed the thought and pulled the blanket tighter around me as the wind howled louder. The rain now beat heavily against the glass, the sound almost deafening. My mind was starting to drift when a sudden noise broke through the storm. A faint creak, like footsteps on the floor above me. I froze. The sound had come from upstairs, but I knew I was the only one home. My roommates were gone, and no one had been here for hours. I tried to convince myself it was just the house settling. Old buildings like this one were prone to strange noises, especially when the weather was as bad as it was tonight. But the creak was followed by another, louder this time. It sounded like someone was walking slowly across the floor above me. My heart began to race, and I strained to listen. There it was again. A deliberate, measured step, like someone was pacing back and forth in the apartment above. I stood up, my legs trembling slightly, and glanced at the clock. It was almost 11 now. I hadn't heard any footsteps earlier when I had first arrived home, and the sound was getting clearer, more distinct. I didn't know what to do. Should I call someone? Was I imagining it? I crept to the hallway, the sound of my own breath louder than I would have liked. I hesitated for a moment, then grabbed the phone from the table and dialed my friend, Mark. He was someone I could count on, always willing to listen to my ramblings or provide a distraction when I needed one. The phone rang 3 times before he picked up. "Hey, what's up?" he answered, his voice warm and familiar. "Mark, you have to help me. I think there's someone upstairs," I said, my voice shaky. "Wait, what? Upstairs? In your building?" His voice had shifted, concern seeping through. "I swear, Mark, I've been hearing footsteps from above. I'm the only one home, so there's no way." Before I could finish, there was another loud creak above me, closer this time. I jumped and instinctively pulled the phone away from my ear, staring wide-eyed at the ceiling. "Okay, calm down," Mark said, his tone now serious. Is anyone else supposed to be there? Maybe the landlord came by or something?" "I don't think so. I haven't heard from Mr. Hargrove. No one's supposed to be up there." My voice faltered, the uncertainty creeping in. "All right, listen," Mark said, sounding more insistent now. "I want you to lock up all your doors and windows and stay on the phone with me until you feel better, okay? I'll be here. You're just letting your imagination get the best of you." I nodded to myself, even though I knew Mark couldn't see me. He was probably right. Maybe I was just spooked by the storm. I was about to respond when the next noise shattered the silence. A loud bang. It came from above, followed by a dragging sound like something heavy was being moved across the floor. My heart raced. "Mark, there's something up there," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I swear I'm not imagining this." There was a long pause on the other end of the phone. "Okay, all right, you need to stay calm. Do you have a weapon? Anything? A bat or something?" "No, The words stuck in my throat. I didn't want to sound paranoid. I didn't want to be crazy. But the sounds from upstairs weren't normal. They weren't the house settling. I heard Mark's voice again, but it was quieter this time, more distant. "Listen, just get out of there. Go outside if you can and wait for me. I'll be there in a few minutes." I hung up the phone, panic setting in. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't just sit and wait for whatever was upstairs to come down. The air felt thick and suffocating, and every creak of the floorboards above me sent a jolt of fear through my chest. I rushed to the door, but as I reached for the handle, a loud crash from upstairs made me freeze. I couldn't move. I glanced at the kitchen, wondering if I should grab a knife or something to defend myself, but then I realized that I would have no idea how to use it in an emergency. I had to leave. Just as I was about to turn around and flee the apartment, I heard it. A low whisper, faint but distinct, coming from above. It wasn't just the sound of footsteps anymore. Someone, or something, was talking. "Get out! Leave now!" The words were barely audible, but they sent a chill down my spine. I stood there, frozen, the handle of the door still clutched in my hand. The whispering continued, growing clearer, more insistent. "Get out! Leave now!" Suddenly, the door to the apartment flung open, and I gasped, my heart nearly stopping. There, standing in the doorway, was Mr. Hargrove. His pale face was ashen, his eyes hollow and sunken. His clothes were worn and stained, but it was the way he looked at me that sent a surge of terror through my body. His gaze was vacant, as though he were staring right through me. What are you doing here?" I stammered, stepping back. I live here, he said slowly, his voice raspy like it hadn't been used in years. His words didn't make sense. Mr. Hargrove had never mentioned living upstairs. In fact, I was sure he didn't even stay in the building. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of it. But then he smiled. The smile was not a friendly gesture. It was cruel, twisted, and it sent a wave of nausea through me. I wanted to scream, but my throat closed up, and I stumbled backward, tripping over the rug. Before I could get to my feet, the whispering from upstairs grew louder, the words clearer. Get out! Leave now! The voice was coming from somewhere near the ceiling, and as I looked up, I saw something moving in the shadows. It was a figure, tall, dark, and shifting unnaturally. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, and it moved toward me with an unnatural speed, its limbs jerking in grotesque angles. I screamed, stumbling to the door, but Mr. Hargrove was blocking my way. His grin had grown wider, stretching impossibly across his face. His hand reached out, fingers long and gnarled like something not entirely human. Leave now, he whispered again. I pushed past him, throwing open the door, and bolted out into the rain without looking back. The night was cold and the rain poured down, but I didn't care. I ran through the streets, not stopping until I reached Mark's apartment, my heart still pounding in my chest. I don't know what happened that night in my apartment. I haven't been back since. I moved out the next morning, leaving everything behind. I couldn't stay there any longer, not with the memory of Mr. Hargrove's empty eyes and that awful smile. But sometimes when it rains heavily, I hear the whispering again. Get out. Leave now. Story the end.
Story number 3.
The storm had been raging for hours, the wind whipping against the windows and the rain battering the roof in a continuous, deafening roar. It was the kind of night that made the house feel as though it were alive, creaking, groaning, and shifting in ways that suggested it was holding its breath, waiting for something. The house had always been quiet, a little too quiet, but tonight the silence felt oppressive, as if something were about to break it. For a long time, Lucy had loved the peace that came with living in an old, isolated farmhouse. Nestled at the edge of the woods, the house was centuries old, its wooden beams weathered by years of storms, just like this one. She had inherited it from her grandmother, who had passed away just a few months ago, and had decided to move in, hoping for a fresh start. But tonight, that peace felt different. The house seemed to hold something within its walls, something that wasn't quite right. Lucy sat by the fire, her legs tucked beneath her as she read a book, trying to distract herself from the feeling of unease that had settled over her. The flickering light of the fire cast long shadows on the walls, and the storm outside was the only sound to break the silence. She tried to focus on her reading, but her mind kept drifting. The rain seemed to beat harder against the windows, almost like it was trying to get in. And then there was a sound, a soft, almost imperceptible knock. Lucy's eyes snapped to the door of the living room, her heart skipping a beat. The wind was howling outside, but this sound had been different. It was too deliberate, too rhythmic. A knock. She pushed herself off the chair and slowly walked toward the door, her feet barely making a sound on the hardwood floors. The house was old, so she had expected the usual creaks, but this felt intentional. She reached for the handle, but her hand faltered before touching it, and her breath caught in her throat. The knock came again, louder and closer. It was coming from the kitchen, down the hallway just beyond the living room. Lucy stood still for a moment, her mind racing. She had been alone in the house all day. She hadn't invited anyone over, and there wasn't anyone nearby, at least that she knew of. The house was secluded, miles from the nearest neighbor. She hadn't even heard a car pass by. Still, her curiosity got the better of her, and she crept toward the kitchen, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. The house was eerily still, the air thick with tension. The sound of the storm outside only made the silence inside feel more suffocating. As she passed through the narrow hallway, she glanced toward the kitchen. The door was slightly ajar, and a faint light from the kitchen illuminated the dark hall. Her heart beat faster as she stepped closer. The door creaked as she pushed it open. Nothing. The kitchen was empty, the table untouched, the old stove and sink sitting in the quiet. The rain slashed against the windows, casting erratic shadows on the walls. Lucy scanned the room. Everything was exactly as it should be. No one was there. But then the hairs on her neck rose, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The air in the kitchen felt thick, heavy, as if something unseen were just behind her. She turned quickly, her breath catching in her throat, but the room was still. No movement. Still, the feeling wouldn't go away. She felt cold, unnervingly cold, and a sudden chill ran down her spine. And that's when it happened. A soft, rasping whisper echoed in the kitchen like a breath too close to her ear. "Help me." Lucy froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The voice was faint, distant, but unmistakable. She wasn't imagining it. Something was here. The whisper seemed to come from all around her, a sound that filled the room but had no clear source. It was as though the walls themselves were speaking, the very house alive with the voice of someone lost. Her legs felt weak, but she forced herself to move, slowly backing away from the room. Her pulse hammered in her ears, and her skin crawled. She reached for the door to leave the kitchen, but before she could grab the handle, the temperature dropped suddenly, so fast it took her breath away. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Help me." Her heart raced. She spun around, her eyes darting around the room for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. The kitchen was empty, and yet the voice persisted. She could feel its presence surrounding her, pressing in on her from all sides. The house groaned as if it were shifting under the weight of something unseen. The whisper became a wail, a long, mournful sound that seemed to echo from the very walls. Lucy's mind reeled. She had to get out of there. Now. Her body moved on instinct as she bolted out of the kitchen, her breath coming in sharp gasps. She sprinted down the hallway toward the staircase, her feet pounding against the wooden floor. The storm outside raged louder as she ascended the stairs, her legs trembling beneath her, but she didn't stop to look back. As she reached the landing at the top of the stairs, something caught her eye. A figure, standing at the far end of the hallway just before the guest room. It was tall, dark, and gaunt, almost indistinct as though it were made of shadow itself. Its eyes, however, glowed faintly, and for a brief moment Lucy could see them clearly, two empty sockets staring at her with an unblinking gaze. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there watching her. Her blood ran cold. "Who are you?" Lucy whispered, her voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching, waiting. Lucy's heart hammered in her chest as she turned and fled to her room. She slammed the door behind her and locked it, her breath ragged in her throat. But as she stood there, leaning against the door, she heard something that made her stomach drop. The soft sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the hallway. Something was walking toward her. Her pulse raced as the footsteps grew louder, closer. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. The door handle turned slowly. No. Lucy stepped back, her mind racing. She had to escape. The windows. She had to get out through the windows. Her heart thudded in her ears as she rushed to the window and threw it open. The storm howled outside, the rain pouring down in sheets. It was too high for her to jump, but it didn't matter. She had to leave. She had to get out of the house. But before she could climb out, she froze. A shadow crossed the window, moving slowly past, and the footsteps stopped. She could see the outline of the figure standing just outside, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. The whispering came again. "Help me." Lucy backed away from the window, her legs shaking, and collapsed onto the floor. She didn't know what to do. She couldn't think. Her mind was spinning with fear. The figure outside the window lingered for a long moment, then disappeared into the storm. But the whispering didn't stop. It echoed in her ears, reverberating through the walls. "I'm here," it whispered. "I'm always here." Lucy buried her head in her hands, trembling uncontrollably. She couldn't escape. Not tonight. Not ever. The house wasn't just a house. It was something more, something ancient. And whatever it was, it had found her. Story, the end.
Story number 4.
It had been a long week for Sophie. She had just moved into her new apartment, a small 2-bedroom place on the edge of town, away from the noise of city life. After spending the past few years in a bustling urban environment, the solitude of this new place seemed like a welcome change. The apartment was tucked in a quiet building on a narrow, tree-lined street. its thick brick walls giving it an old, almost comforting feel. It was just the kind of place Sophie had imagined herself living in, with large windows that let in the soft light of the setting sun and high ceilings that made the small space feel open. The move had been tiring, but it was over now, and Sophie was looking forward to peace and quiet that awaited her. The streets were rarely busy, and the few neighbors she had seemed friendly enough. Still, there was something about the apartment that unsettled her, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. Maybe it was the silence that seemed to echo through the empty rooms, or the way the old wooden floors creaked with every step. Whatever it was, it lingered in the back of her mind. It was a rainy night when things first started to feel off. The kind of rain that never seemed to stop, heavy and relentless. The kind that made everything outside blur into a dark, gray mist. Sophie had just finished dinner and was sitting in the living room reading a book and sipping tea when she first heard the noise. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, like a tap, tap, tap coming from the walls. Sophie froze, her hand still holding the cup, the warmth of the tea slowly fading as she listened more closely. It was a rhythmic tapping, as if someone was knocking lightly from the other side of the wall. She glanced around the room, her eyes scanning the corners, but there was nothing. The old pipes in the building were known to make strange noises sometimes, so Sophie tried to brush it off. Still, the sound was odd. It wasn't like the usual groaning of the house. This was deliberate, purposeful. She set her cup down and stood up, walking to the wall where the sound seemed to be coming from. She pressed her ear against it, listening carefully. For a moment, there was nothing. Just the steady patter of the rain against the windows and the soft creaking of the floorboards. Sophie sighed, relieved that the sound had stopped. She returned to her chair, trying to convince herself that it had just been the house settling, or the wind. The storm outside was powerful, and wind could make things sound eerie. But then it came again. Tap, tap, tap. Louder this time, and unmistakably from the wall. Sophie's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just the wind. There was something else in the sound now. It was as if someone or something was trying to get her attention. The tapping was almost frantic. Sophie stood up again, her feet heavy against the wooden floor, and walked slowly to the wall. She hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. She was new to the apartment, and while there were rumors about the place being old, no one had mentioned anything strange. Maybe it was just the plumbing, or the pipes in the building that were acting up. She reached out and gently knocked on the wall, trying to mimic the sound. Nothing. For a second, Sophie stood there, listening intently, but there was no reply. She turned away, but before she could make it back to her chair, she heard something else. Something much louder. The unmistakable sound of a door creaking open. Sophie froze. Her breath caught in her throat as she slowly turned toward the hallway that led to her bedroom. The door to her bedroom was slightly ajar, as it had been all evening, and now she could have sworn it was moving. She held her breath, watching in disbelief as the door creaked wider, almost as if something was pushing it open from the other side. Sophie's pulse raced, and the air in the room suddenly felt thick, as if the very walls were closing in around her. The room was still. No footsteps, no sounds of movement, just the door slowly opening in the dim light. Sophie stood rooted to the spot, unable to move. She wanted to call out, to scream, but her throat felt dry. She could feel the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Something wasn't right. The air felt colder now, even though the heating was on. After what seemed like an eternity, the door stopped moving, standing wide open. Sophie swallowed hard and forced herself to walk toward it. Her feet felt heavy as she crossed the threshold into the hallway. The floorboards creaked under her weight, and she instinctively looked down the narrow corridor to her bedroom, where the door was now fully open. The room beyond was dark, and the bed was undisturbed. Everything seemed normal, but there was something in the air, a palpable tension, as though something was waiting for her. She stepped forward cautiously, her heart pounding. The hallway seemed to stretch out endlessly, the shadows along the walls growing deeper. She paused just in front of the bedroom door, her hand hovering near the handle. Her mind raced, trying to rationalize what she was feeling. Maybe it was just the wind again, or maybe she had left the door ajar by mistake, and now the draft had pushed it open. But even as she thought this, she knew deep down that there was more to it than that. Then the silence was broken. The sound of a soft, muffled cry filled the air, coming from somewhere in the room beyond. Sophie's heart stopped, and she stepped back, the blood draining from her face. The cry was faint, almost inaudible, but it was unmistakable. It sounded like someone in pain, like someone trapped, desperately calling for help. Sophie couldn't breathe. Her body was frozen in place, unable to move. The sound came again, louder this time, and she felt a sudden coldness sweep through her, settling deep in her bones. It was coming from her bedroom, from the bed. There was no one in the room, but the sound felt so real. It wasn't in her mind. It was there, in the air, a presence that couldn't be explained. Her eyes darted to the shadows of the room, looking for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. The door was open, the bed empty, yet the air was heavy with the sound of the cry. It was a woman's voice, or at least that's what Sophie thought. It was faint, but unmistakable, and it chilled her to the core. She stepped forward again, her hand trembling as it reached for the door. She pushed it open slowly, half expecting to see something. A figure, an image, something that could explain the sound. But there was nothing. No one. Just the empty, dimly lit bedroom. Sophie walked in, her feet dragging against the floor as if she were wading through a thick fog. The room felt colder now, almost freezing, and she shivered as she looked around. The bed, the nightstand, the dresser, everything seemed untouched. But the air was thick with an unsettling presence. Then she heard it again, a soft, mournful cry. It was coming from the closet. Sophie turned slowly, her heart hammering in her chest. The closet door was slightly ajar, just enough to see the darkened interior. She stood there for a moment, staring at it, her mind racing. The voice seemed to be coming from inside, though it wasn't a voice she could recognize. It was filled with sorrow, like a cry from someone who had been lost for a long time. Sophie's legs felt weak, but she forced herself to approach the closet. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the cool wood of the door as she gently pulled it open. The closet was empty, completely empty. There was nothing inside, no sign of any presence, no ghostly figure, nothing but the hollow darkness. But the crying continued. Louder now. It wasn't coming from the closet. It was coming from behind her. Sophie spun around, but the room was still empty. There was no one there. Yet the cry echoed in her ears, filling her mind with a deep, inescapable dread. She wanted to run, to escape, but her feet felt like they were glued to the floor. Suddenly, the air in the room shifted. It grew heavier, colder. The sound of footsteps crept in from behind her, soft but distinct, growing closer with each passing second. Sophie's breath hitched in her throat as she slowly turned toward the source. A figure stood in the doorway. The tall, shadowy figure of a woman, her face pale and distorted, her eyes hollow pits of darkness. She was staring at Sophie, unmoving, her mouth open in an endless, silent scream. Sophie tried to scream, but no sound came out. She backed away, her legs shaking uncontrollably as the figure moved toward her, slowly, deliberately. The woman's presence filled the room, the air growing thick with her coldness. Sophie stumbled backward into the wall, unable to move or think. She could feel the woman's cold breath on her face, the chill of her presence sinking deep into her bones. And then, just as quickly as the woman had appeared, she was gone. The room was empty, silent. Sophie was left standing in the middle of the room, gasping for breath, her heart racing, as the rain continued to pour outside. The woman was gone, but the feeling remained. She wasn't alone. Story the end.
Story number 5.
The storm had rolled in without warning, drenching the streets with rain that seemed to fall in sheets, as though the sky itself were weeping. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows of my small apartment, and I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. The clock on the wall showed 11:30 p.m. I was alone for the night, my roommate having gone away for the weekend to visit her parents, and I had opted to stay in. The quiet solitude should have been a comfort, but tonight, it wasn't. The apartment was old, built sometime in the late 1920s, and it showed its age. The hardwood floors creaked underfoot, the walls were thin, and I could hear nearly every noise from the surrounding apartments. I'd gotten used to it over the last year or so, but tonight even the smallest sounds seemed to echo in the empty space. I sat on the couch with a book, trying to distract myself from the eerie ambiance the storm created, but my thoughts kept wandering back to the strange occurrences I'd experienced in the past few weeks. Small things, really. Objects misplaced, a flickering light, shadows that seemed to move on their own, but they'd been building up in my mind, and tonight they felt more vivid than ever. I pushed the book aside, deciding it was best to distract myself with something else. I turned on the TV, but the static of the storm was muffling the sound of the broadcast. I grabbed my phone to check in on social media, scrolling mindlessly until my eyes caught the time again. 11:50 p.m. It was then that I heard it. A soft thud, like something heavy had been dropped. It came from the hallway just outside my bedroom door. I paused, trying to make sense of the noise. I was alone, so there was no reason for anyone to be in the hallway. The only other person who might have been there would be the building's maintenance worker. But he never worked this late, especially not on a weekend. Another thud. It was louder this time. Closer. My stomach knotted, and I stood up, feeling an icy shiver crawl up my spine. I slowly moved toward the door, my heart racing in my chest. The hallway outside my apartment was dim, lit only by the faint glow of the streetlights filtering through the blinds. I opened the door carefully, just enough to peek into the hallway, but it was empty. No one was there. I let out a shaky breath, telling myself it was just the storm playing tricks on my mind. The building had its quirks. The wind sometimes pushed against the old walls in strange ways, making noises that sounded like footsteps or something falling. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I felt it deep in my bones, a coldness that seemed to crawl along the edges of my skin. I slowly closed the door, locking it behind me. I tried to ignore the growing sense of dread creeping up my neck, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I walked back to the couch, trying to settle myself again. The storm outside raged on, its fury increasing with every passing minute. The wind slammed against the windows with such force that I jumped every time. I checked my phone again, hoping that the familiar distractions of social media or a quick text from my roommate would calm my nerves. But then I heard it again, a faint scraping sound. It was coming from the direction of my bedroom this time. I froze. My blood ran cold. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the storm. This was something different. The sound was deliberate, slow, like something or someone was moving around in my room. I stood up, my body trembling with a mixture of fear and disbelief. There was no one in the apartment with me. I had made sure of that. But if that was true, then what was making the sound? I slowly walked toward my bedroom door, my hand gripping the edge of the frame as I approached. The air in the hallway was thick, almost suffocating, and every step I took seemed to echo too loudly in the silence. The scraping sound was gone now, but I could still feel it, whatever it was, lurking just behind the door. I took a deep breath and slowly turned the knob, pushing the door open just a crack. The room was dark, save for the faint light from the streetlights outside, casting long shadows on the walls. At first, I saw nothing out of the ordinary. The bed was undisturbed, the curtains hung still, and my dresser stood quietly in the corner. But then, my eyes caught something unusual, the mirror on the wall. It wasn't a large mirror, just a small oval one above my dresser. But in the reflection, something was wrong. The bed appeared perfectly normal, yet the reflection of the room in the mirror was not. I blinked, confused, and looked again. There, just barely visible in the reflection, was a figure. It was a shadow, dark and featureless, standing at the foot of the bed. I didn't want to believe it. I wanted to turn away, to slam the door shut and run, but I couldn't. My feet felt like they were rooted to the floor as I stared at the shadow. It didn't move, not even when I shifted my weight. The air grew heavier, thicker. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, and then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow was gone. I backed away from the door, heart racing. I had to be imagining it, right? Maybe it was just the storm playing tricks on me, distorting the reflection in the mirror. I took a few steps back, trying to calm myself, but the room felt wrong now. The hairs on my arms stood up as I slowly turned to leave. But then the door slammed shut. I froze. The force of the slam rattled the walls and made the windows shudder. My breath caught in my throat as I tried to comprehend what had just happened. There was no wind. The door had been open. There was no way it should have slammed shut like that. I reached for the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked from the inside. Panic began to rise in my chest. I pulled at the knob harder, but it wouldn't give. I felt the cold sweat on my forehead as I realized I was trapped. I was trapped. The sound of the storm outside was drowned out by a strange, low whisper. It was faint at first, barely audible over the pounding of my heart, but then it grew louder, clearer, as though it was coming from all around me. "Leave," the voice whispered. I spun around, searching the room for any sign of movement, but there was nothing there. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed deeper now, darker, as though they were pressing in on me. The temperature had dropped, and I could see my breath misting in the air. I pressed my back to the door, terrified to move, too frightened to do anything but wait. The whisper continued, each word more insistent, more chilling than the last. "Leave now." I had no idea how long I stood there, frozen in place, my eyes darting around the room. The whispers grew louder and louder, until they felt like they were inside my head. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The air grew still, the room returned to its former state of quiet, and the door, for some unknown reason, suddenly opened. I stumbled backward, disoriented, my hands shaking as I stepped out into the hallway. I didn't look back. I didn't stop running until I was out the front door and into the storm, the rain soaking me through. I didn't care. I couldn't stay there any longer. The whispers, the shadow, the locked door, they had all been too much. I didn't go back that night. I couldn't, and to this day I haven't. Some nights, when the rain is particularly heavy, I can still hear the whispers. Soft at first, but unmistakable. "Leave now." Story the end.
Story number 6.
The rain fell in torrents, tapping against the windows in a rhythmic, almost hypnotic pattern. Outside, the wind howled, whipping through the trees and rattling the old, creaky house. Inside, everything was quiet. Too quiet. The only sound was the steady tick of the old grandfather clock in the hallway, marking each passing minute. Maria sat on the couch in her living room, curled up under a thick blanket with a book in her lap. It was just past midnight, and she had spent the evening alone, reading and listening to the storm rage outside. It had been a long, exhausting week, and all she wanted was some peace and quiet before bed. But tonight there was something about the house that felt different. Something about the darkness outside that seemed to press in on her. She shook off the unease that had been creeping into her thoughts. It was nothing. The house was old, and old houses made strange noises, especially during storms. She was fine. Nothing was wrong. She focused on the book in her hands, trying to calm herself. But then she heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible sound, like the creak of a floorboard. It was faint, but there was no mistaking it. Maria's head snapped up, and she glanced toward the hallway. She had lived in the house for nearly a year, and she was used to the occasional creaks and groans of the old wood. But this sound had been different. It had come from somewhere closer, somewhere behind her. Her pulse quickened, and she set the book down, straining her ears to listen. The wind howled louder outside, but in the brief moments of silence between gusts, she could hear it again. A faint shuffle, a soft drag of something heavy across the floor. Maria stood up slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. The room seemed to shrink around her, the darkness beyond the walls pressing closer. She didn't know why, but the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She tried to rationalize it. It was just the house settling. Maybe it was the wind moving things around outside, or the branches scraping against the windows. Still, the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave her. She took a deep breath and forced herself to move toward the hallway. Her footsteps echoed through the quiet house, making her feel even more alone. As she passed the old staircase, she glanced up the dark steps, half expecting to see something, or someone, lurking in the shadows. But there was nothing. The staircase was empty. She reached the hallway and looked around. The house was still. The door to the kitchen was closed, the hallway light dim. Everything seemed normal, but the weight in the air was heavier than it should have been. She listened again, her heart racing, but there was nothing now. No sounds, no creaks, no whispers. She took another step forward, her eyes scanning the darkness. Suddenly, the sound came again. This time, it was unmistakable. The slow drag of something heavy scraping across the floor. It was coming from upstairs. Maria froze. She was alone in the house. She was sure of it. There was no one else here. Her mind raced as she considered the possibilities. The house had been empty for days, and she had heard no one come in or out. Maybe it was just her imagination, but the sound was so real, so clear. It was the sound of something, or someone, walking across the floor above her. The feeling of being watched intensified, and she instinctively took a step back toward the staircase. The sound was louder now, a slow, dragging shuffle coming closer. Her breath caught in her throat. What the hell was it? She didn't know what to do. She could feel her pulse pounding in her ears, and her skin felt cold, prickling with fear. The sound was growing closer. With every step it took, her own steps felt heavier, as if the weight of the house was pressing down on her. Maria moved slowly, cautiously up the stairs. She didn't know why she was going up there, but she had to know. Her feet felt leaden, but she forced herself to keep moving, her hand gripping the railing as she ascended. The floorboards creaked under her weight, but the sound from above was louder now. It was unmistakable. Someone was in the house. At the top of the stairs, she paused and listened. Her heart was racing, and her breath came in shallow gasps. She peered down the dark hallway toward her bedroom at the end, the door slightly ajar. There was a faint light coming from inside, the flicker of a candle or something else, something that hadn't been there earlier. She didn't remember leaving it on. The shuffling sound came again. It was coming from her bedroom. Maria hesitated, her mind torn between fear and curiosity. But she had to know. She had to see what was in there. She couldn't ignore it. Not tonight. With trembling hands, she pushed the bedroom door open, the hinges creaking loudly in the silence. Cananas. She gasped when she saw the room. It was exactly how she had left it, except for one thing. The window was wide open, the curtains blowing in the wind. The rain was coming in, soaking the floor and the bed. But what really caught her attention was the small rocking chair in the corner of the room. It was rocking gently back and forth, despite there being no wind inside. Maria's breath caught in her throat. She stared at the chair, her body frozen in place. The sound, the shuffling, dragging sound, had come from the room. It had come from the chair. She stepped into the room, her eyes never leaving the chair. As she got closer, she noticed something else. There were footprints in the wet carpet leading toward the bed, small, wet, and faint, as if someone had been walking through the room with muddy shoes. But there was no one there. No one at all. The air grew colder, and the chair creaked, rocking again. Slowly, deliberately. Maria's heart was in her throat. She knew she should run. She knew she should get out of the house, but something held her there. Her eyes flickered to the bed, and that's when she saw it. A figure, a woman, sitting on the edge of the bed, facing away from her. Maria's blood ran cold. The figure was dressed in a long, dark gown, her long hair falling in tangled waves over her shoulders. The woman sat motionless, as though waiting. Her hands rested in her lap, but there was something unsettling about her stillness. Maria wanted to scream, to turn and run, but her body refused to obey. She could only stare at the figure. The woman's head was tilted slightly, as if listening to something Maria couldn't hear. Her breath caught as the figure slowly turned to face her. The woman's face was pale, almost ghostly, with hollow eyes that stared directly at Maria. Her lips were cracked and dry, as though they had been silent for years. And then the woman spoke, her voice a raspy whisper that sent chills down Maria's spine. "Why are you here?" the woman asked, her voice barely more than a breath. Maria didn't answer. She couldn't. Her throat had gone dry, and her legs felt weak beneath her. The woman's eyes never left her, her gaze hollow and searching. "You shouldn't be here," the woman continued, her voice barely audible over the sound of the wind. "This house is mine." Maria felt her legs finally give way, and she collapsed onto the floor, unable to move, unable to speak. The room seemed to close in on her, the walls pressing against her chest. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, and she could see her breath in the air. The woman stood up slowly, her body jerking unnaturally as though it were not fully in control of its movements. She began to walk toward Maria, her feet dragging across the wet carpet, leaving behind muddy footprints with each step. Maria tried to crawl backward, but her body wouldn't respond. The woman's eyes were locked on hers, her face twisted into something unrecognizable, an expression of longing, of anger, of desperation. "You shouldn't have come. You shouldn't have come," the woman whispered again. "Now you belong to me." Maria let out a strangled cry as the woman reached out toward her. Just as the cold fingers were about to touch her, the door slammed shut behind her and the figure was gone. The room was empty. Maria was alone, but the cold remained. The sound of the rain outside had faded, leaving nothing but the oppressive silence in its wake. The rocking chair had stopped moving. The footprints had disappeared. But Maria didn't move. She couldn't. The fear had paralyzed her, and she knew, deep down, that the house had not let her go. It would never let her go. Not now. Story the end.
Story number 7.
The storm came in suddenly, with little warning. 1 minute, the skies were clear, and the next, they were dark, roiling with thunder and streaked with the sharp brilliance of lightning. I sat on my couch, alone in my small apartment on the top floor of an old building, a cup of tea in hand, attempting to enjoy what was supposed to be a relaxing night in. My roommate Sarah had gone to visit her family for the weekend, leaving me with the apartment all to myself. I had been looking forward to the solitude, needing some time to unwind after a hectic week at work. The apartment itself had a certain charm, though there was no denying it was old. Dating back to the 1920s, the creaky floors and faded wallpaper gave it an eerie atmosphere that I had grown used to over the months. The walls were thin, and the building was in a neighborhood where the traffic never fully died down. Yet tonight, with the storm crashing against the windows, I could feel the apartment growing quieter. The streets outside had emptied, the rain driving everyone inside, with only the sounds of the storm and my own thoughts. The wind rattled the windows, the soft hum of the heater in the corner, a quiet comfort. I tried to focus on the book in my lap, but the sound of the rain and the storm outside kept pulling my attention away. My thoughts drifted, and for a moment, I allowed myself to imagine that the storm was a little more than just weather, like a sign or some omen. It wasn't that I was superstitious, but there was something unsettling about the way the storm had descended so suddenly. It felt like an interruption, an uninvited guest. I pulled my blanket tighter around my shoulders and settled deeper into the couch. I wasn't one to get spooked easily, but I found myself glancing at the corners of the room, half expecting to see something moving in the shadows. I chuckled nervously to myself, dismissing the thought. But then, from somewhere deep within the apartment, I heard a faint sound. A soft thud, almost imperceptible. I froze, straining my ears. Another thud, followed by a faint scrape, like something being dragged across the floor. The sound wasn't coming from the storm outside, nor was it the typical creaking of the building settling under the pressure of the rain. This was different. I slowly set my tea down, the warmth of the cup gone from my hands as my grip tightened. There were no other rooms occupied in the apartment. No one else was here. The sound came again, clearer this time. Something heavy, being moved. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I stood up, my heart beating faster. I glanced toward the hallway. The door to my bedroom was closed, and nothing seemed out of place, but the feeling of being watched crept over me. I told myself it was just the house settling. The building was old, after all, and the storm was only making the sounds more pronounced. I took a deep breath and walked toward the hallway, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet with each step. As I reached the door to my bedroom, I paused, hand hovering over the doorknob. The apartment was eerily silent now, the storm outside providing the only sound. My heartbeat thudded in my ears. Slowly, I turned the knob and pushed the door open, peering into the darkened room. It looked normal. The bed was undisturbed, the curtains pulled tight against the rain, the dresser, the shelves, all were in their places. Nothing out of the ordinary. I stepped inside, feeling the strange chill in the air. My breath came out in small puffs, and I shivered. Maybe it was just my imagination, but still the feeling of something being wrong lingered. I reached for the light switch and flicked it on. The room illuminated, and I exhaled in relief, telling myself I was just being paranoid. Yet, as my eyes scanned the room, something caught my attention. The mirror. It was a full-length mirror, framed in dark wood, standing against the far wall beside the window. At first glance, nothing seemed out of place. But as I looked closer, I realized that the reflection of the room in the mirror didn't quite match the room itself. The mirror showed the bed, the dresser, the chair in the corner, but there was something else in the reflection. A shadow. It was standing near the window, But when I turned to look, the corner of the room was empty. The shadow in the mirror was tall and dark, with no distinct features, just an unnatural blackness that didn't belong. My breath caught in my throat. I stepped back quickly, my heart racing. The shadow remained in the reflection, unmoving. I rubbed my eyes, telling myself that it was a trick of the light, the storm outside playing games with my perception. But deep down, I knew what I had seen. Before I could process what had happened, a loud crash echoed from the other side of the apartment, followed by a low, guttural sound, like something dragging itself across the floor. I whipped around, my pulse quickening. The sound was coming from the hallway. The way the apartment was laid out, there were no other rooms. The only space was the small living room and the bathroom. But something was moving, dragging itself toward me. I bolted toward the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest, every step sounding too loud in the stillness of the apartment. I reached the doorway, my hands shaking as I turned the corner, and there, just past the kitchen, I saw it. The hallway light was flickering, casting erratic shadows against the walls. The source of the dragging sound was now unmistakable. There was something or someone crawling toward me on the floor, dragging its body with unnatural speed. My mind went blank, my body frozen in fear. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. The figure, cloaked in darkness, seemed to stretch unnaturally long, its limbs twisted at impossible angles. I could hear the sound of its body scraping against the floor like nails on a chalkboard. And then the whispering began. It was soft at first, but it quickly grew louder. "Leave." The voice was raspy, broken, like it had been crying for a long time. "Leave. Now." My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure as it neared, its distorted body dragging itself across the floor with terrifying precision. I had never been so scared in my life. The room seemed to close in around me as the whispering grew louder, more urgent. "Leave. Now." Without thinking, my body reacted on its own. I turned and ran. I didn't care where. I just needed to get out. I rushed toward the front door, throwing it open and stumbling into the hallway outside, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't stop running until I reached the stairwell. The rain pelted me as I ran down the steps, my mind whirling, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I had to get out of the building. The whispers, the shadow, the figure. It was all too much. I reached the street, soaked to the bone, cried help, and only then did I allow myself to stop, breathing heavily. The apartment building loomed behind me, silent and dark. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at it, but eventually I turned and started walking, not knowing where I was going, just needing to put as much distance between me and the apartment as possible. I never went back that night. The storm eventually passed, and the rain subsided, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I had seen in that apartment was still with me, lurking in the shadows. I stayed with a friend that night, and the next day I called the landlord to say I was moving out. I never went back to collect my things. I couldn't, but sometimes on rainy nights when the wind howls just the right way, I hear the whisper again. "Leave now."
Story number 8.
The night I will never forget started as an ordinary evening. It was a cold and rainy evening in early November, the type of weather that envelops you in a quiet, lonely sense of stillness. The rain pattered against the windows, the wind howling every now and then as the storm intensified. It felt like the world had been swallowed by the darkness outside. I had just moved into the house a few months before, a small, older cottage-style home on the edge of town, not far from the woods. It was perfect for me, quiet, private, a little isolated. The rent was cheap, and I loved the charm of it, though. Over time, the quirks of the house began to feel more like a haunting than just wear and tear. The house had always been drafty. The old wooden floors creaked with every step, and the walls groaned like the house was trying to speak. The previous tenant had left abruptly, leaving behind most of their things. That fact had never sat well with me, but I had pushed it aside. It wasn't the first time I had moved into a house with strange history, and it wouldn't be the last. Still, the house had a feeling about it, a presence that seemed to linger. But tonight, that presence felt stronger than ever. I had spent the evening alone, curled up on the couch with a book, the only light coming from the lamp beside me. The rain drummed steadily on the roof, and outside, the world was hidden in darkness, only the distant flash of lightning illuminating the trees that surrounded the property. I had just finished a chapter when I heard the first strange noise. It was soft, almost like the shuffle of footsteps on the old wood floor. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, as it always did during storms, but then I heard it again, a slow, deliberate footfall. I looked up from my book, my heartbeat picking up slightly. The house was still, aside from the sounds of the storm outside. I glanced toward the hallway leading to the bedrooms. The house had been empty since I moved in, and I was alone. I told myself it was nothing. It had to be nothing. But the feeling of being watched lingered. I stood up, setting the book aside, and walked toward the hallway. I was careful with my steps, trying to make as little noise as possible, but the floorboards groaned under my weight, betraying me. I reached the doorway and paused, listening. There was nothing. No sound, no movement. The hallway was dark, the faint light from the living room spilling only a few feet down the narrow corridor. I let out a breath, convinced that I was just letting my mind wander. The house was old, after all, and noises were to be expected. Still, a part of me couldn't shake the sensation of someone else being there. I returned to the living room, my skin prickling with unease. As I sat back down on the couch, I reached for my phone to check the time. I wasn't sure why, but I had this odd sense of urgency, like I needed to do something, anything, to break the strange stillness that had settled over the house. The wind howled again, louder this time, and the rain grew heavier. My phone buzzed, and I looked down to see a text from my friend, Mara. "How's the new place? Are you doing okay?" I typed a quick reply, telling her everything was fine, though I wasn't entirely sure of that myself. As I hit send, I heard it again. The same soft shuffle of footsteps, this time closer. It wasn't my imagination. I could hear the distinct sound of something, someone moving in the hallway. The sound was unmistakable, heavy, deliberate. I froze, my blood running cold. The house was supposed to be empty. The landlord had assured me of that. So why did it feel like there was someone else here with me? I stood up slowly, my hands trembling, the pack, and walked toward the hallway once again. This time, I didn't hesitate. The sound was louder now, like a slow march toward the living room. I stepped cautiously, almost afraid of what I might find, but when I reached the doorway, there was no one there. The hallway remained empty, and the air felt cold, unnaturally so. I stepped inside, running my fingers along the wall as I looked into each room, expecting to find someone hiding. The bathroom door was ajar, but there was no one there either. The guest bedroom was just as empty. But then, I noticed something. A faint, almost imperceptible mark on the floor. A scuff that hadn't been there before. The floor was old, the wood worn down from years of use, but this mark, it was fresh. It was as though someone had dragged their feet along the floor, as if someone had been walking, just moments before. I stepped back, a wave of cold fear washing over me. I couldn't explain it. I didn't want to explain it. I turned and hurried back to the living room, but as I did, I heard it again. A low, muffled sound. A voice. It was soft at first, almost a whisper, but then it grew louder, clearer. "Leave." The voice was raspy, strained, like someone was speaking through clenched teeth. My stomach twisted in fear. I hadn't heard anyone enter the house. I hadn't heard a door open, no footsteps, no knock. But there it was, the unmistakable sound of a voice at her right there in the hallway. I froze, paralyzed by the sound. "Leave," it repeated, growing more urgent, more desperate. I could feel my chest tightening, the panic creeping up my throat. I ran to the door and threw it open, intending to escape, but the rain outside was relentless. I couldn't leave, not yet. I turned back toward the hallway, and as I did, I saw something. A shadow. It flickered in the corner of my vision, moving with an unnatural fluidity, its outline shifting in the dim light. My heart skipped a beat, and I couldn't move. I couldn't tear my eyes away. The shadow grew, becoming clearer, more defined. It looked like a figure, a man, perhaps, tall and thin, its form shifting in and out of view, like it was struggling to remain visible. The air grew colder, and I could see my breath in the darkness. The figure was near the door, just outside my line of sight. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't speak. The only sound was the heavy, rasping breath of the thing, or whatever it was, standing just beyond my vision. "Leave," it whispered again, its voice sharp and hoarse. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The silence in the house was deafening. I didn't dare move. The air felt thick with something I couldn't quite name, a presence that seemed to linger even after the figure had vanished. My heart was pounding, and I could feel the blood rushing in my ears. I stayed in that spot, staring at the dark corner of the room where the figure had been, unable to move, unable to make a sound. Every inch of me screamed to run, to get out of the house, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. I was paralyzed with fear. I must have stood there for hours, though I had no idea how long it had been. Time felt distorted, like it was stretching, warping in the aftermath of whatever had just happened. Finally, I found the courage to move. I grabbed my phone again, my hands still trembling, and dialed Mara's number. She answered after the first ring. "Hey, I'm really scared," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "There's something in the house. I think it's haunted." Mara's voice was calm, though I could hear the concern in her tone. "It's okay. Just stay calm. I'll come over. Stay on the phone with me, okay?" I nodded, though I knew she couldn't see me. I couldn't explain what had just happened, or I couldn't explain the shadow, the voice, the overwhelming sense of dread that had settled over me like a weight. And then, as I stood there, phone pressed to my ear, the door slammed shut behind me, cutting off the room from the rest of the house. I turned quickly, my heart racing again, and the voice came once more. This time, louder, clearer. "Leave now." I didn't hesitate. I ran. Story the end.
Story number 9.
The wind howled through the trees, sending a shiver through the empty street. The rain had been coming down relentlessly for hours, soaking everything in its path. The night was dark, and the only sound was the rhythmic tap of raindrops against the windows and the occasional crack of thunder in the distance. Megan sat in her living room, curled up on the couch, wrapped in a thick blanket. Her fingers gently stroked the pages of the book in her lap, but her mind was elsewhere. The house felt different tonight. She couldn't quite explain it, but there was a certain weight in the air, an unease that hung just beneath the surface. It wasn't that she was afraid exactly, but there was something about the storm, about being alone in this old house, that made her feel like she wasn't entirely by herself. It was a large house, an old Victorian home, with creaky floors and antique furniture that had been passed down through generations. She had moved in a few months ago, thrilled by the charm of the place and the promise of quiet, rural life. The house was beautiful, with intricate woodwork, stained glass windows, and large, airy rooms. But there was also something unsettling about it. Perhaps it was the creaks and groans that came from the walls at night, the flickering of the lights when there was no storm. Or perhaps it was the way the house always seemed to feel just a little too cold, even in the summer. But tonight, it was more than that. Tonight, Megan couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. She glanced toward the window. The wind pushed the branches of the trees outside, casting eerie shadows across the yard. The old house felt like it was breathing, shifting in the storm. Megan set her book aside and hugged her knees to her chest, the blanket wrapped tightly around her. She tried to tell herself it was just the storm, just the wind. But as she sat there in the silence, she couldn't help but feel like something was watching her. A soft creak broke the stillness, coming from the hallway. Megan's head snapped toward the sound, her heart skipping a beat. She was sure she had heard something, but the house was old, and creaks were common. It could have been anything, a shift in the floorboards, the house settling. She took a deep breath and tried to ignore the feeling crawling up her spine. But then there was another sound. This one was unmistakable. A soft shuffle of footsteps on the wooden floor in the hallway. Megan's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment she couldn't move. Her heart was pounding in her chest, and she felt the blood drain from her face. She was alone. There was no one else here. She had checked every door, every window, before settling in for the night. She was certain of it. The footsteps were getting closer now, slow, deliberate, as though someone was walking toward her. The air in the room seemed to grow colder. The temperature dropped, and Megan's breath came out in visible puffs. She stood up quickly, her blanket slipping from her shoulders as she crossed the room to the hallway. The house was eerily silent now, the storm outside muffled by the thick walls. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for her. She reached the end of the hallway and peered into the dark space. There was nothing there, just the old staircase that led to the second floor and the darkened door to the basement. Her skin prickled with the feeling of being watched, but she could see no one. The hallway was empty. Maybe it was just the wind, she told herself. The old house groaned with age, and the storm was making everything feel strange. But as she turned to head back to the living room, she heard it again. This time, the footsteps were right behind her. Megan froze, her heart hammering in her chest. She didn't dare turn around. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Maybe there was an animal in the house. Something had gotten in through an open window, perhaps. She took a step forward, then another. She moved quickly, walking faster, but the footsteps followed her, the soft shuffle of feet right behind her. The sound was too real, too close. She was no longer alone. Megan's breath quickened and panic began to rise in her chest. She turned sharply, ready to face whatever it was, but there was nothing. The hallway was empty, just the dark wooden floors stretching out before her. But the feeling was still there. The oppressive weight in the air, the sensation that someone or something was standing just out of sight, watching her. She backed away slowly, her heart racing in her chest. The house seemed to close in on her, the walls pressing tighter with each step she took. She had to get out. She had to leave. But where could she go? The storm was raging outside, and the roads were impassable. There was nowhere to run. The footsteps started again. This time they were louder, more insistent, as though the person, or whatever it was walking right behind her, just a few inches away. Megan's breath caught in her throat as she spun around, eyes wide, but there was no one there. She wasn't alone. In that moment, a voice, soft and chilling, drifted into her ears. It was a whisper, so faint she almost couldn't hear it, but she did. "Leave," it said. Megan's body froze. The voice was low, almost like a hiss, filled with an unnatural, guttural rasp. It was coming from somewhere behind her, from within the house itself. The hair on the back of her neck stood on end as she turned slowly, her pulse thumping in her ears. The air was thick with a cold that seeped into her bones. The voice whispered again, louder this time, as though it were close, right next to her ear. "Leave this house?" Megan stumbled backward, her eyes darting to the dark corners of the hallway, trying to see where the voice had come from. But all she saw were shadows. The house was silent again, but the oppressive weight of something unseen pressed down on her chest. It wasn't just the storm. It wasn't just the old house. Something was here. Something had been here long before she arrived. Her thoughts raced as she backed away from the voice, unsure of what to do next. Should she run? Should she leave? The front door was just down the hallway, but the footsteps followed her again, this time louder, more determined. She couldn't stay in this house. Whatever was in it wanted her gone. The voice, the footsteps, it was all too real, too close to ignore. Megan made a split-second decision. She turned and ran toward the stairs, the heavy thud of her feet against the wooden floor echoing in the silence. She reached the stairs, but just as her hand gripped the banister, the air around her grew even colder, and she heard the voice one last time. "Leave this place." With one final burst of adrenaline, Megan bolted up the stairs, her feet flying as she reached the top and dashed for her bedroom. She slammed the door behind her and locked it, her heart racing. The storm outside battered against the windows, but it was nothing compared to the storm she felt inside. She sank to the floor, breathing heavily, her hands shaking. She didn't know what had just happened. The house, the voice, the footsteps, they were all too real, too vivid to ignore. But was it possible? Could it be some kind of trick? Some mind playing games on her in the dark? No. She knew what she had heard, what she had felt. Something was in that house with her. The storm raged on outside, but the silence in the house was unbearable now. Megan couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been following her was still out there, waiting. She couldn't escape it. She didn't know how to make it stop. Hours passed, and Megan remained huddled in her room, too terrified to leave, too afraid to even move. The storm outside had subsided, but the unease in the air only seemed to grow stronger. When the sun finally rose, Megan left the room, stepping cautiously down the hallway. The house was still, the footsteps, the whispers, gone. But as she passed by the front door, she froze. There on the floor in front of her was a single footprint. Muddy, Wet. She had been alone. She had locked every door. There was no explanation, except one. She wasn't alone, and she would never be alone again. Story the end.
Story number 10.
The rain was relentless. It hammered against the windows, the sound so constant and intense that it almost drowned out every other noise. The occasional crack of thunder reverberated through the house, rattling the windows and shaking the walls. I sat in the dimly lit living room, a mug of tea cooling on the coffee table in front of me, staring at the swirling storm outside. The wind howled, a mournful sound that echoed through the trees around my house. I had just moved into this small house on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much, just a modest 2-bedroom cottage, but it was all I could afford at the time. The place had character, a creaky wooden floor, old-fashioned fixtures, and an ancient fireplace that didn't quite keep the house warm. But it was secluded, far enough from the hustle and bustle of the city, and that appealed to me. I liked the quiet, the solitude. It felt like the perfect place to reset, to start over after a tumultuous year. But tonight, the house felt different. I couldn't quite place it. The floorboards groaned as if someone was walking around, but I was the only one here. The walls seemed to breathe with the wind, sighing and whispering as if the house itself was alive. I tried to shake off the feeling. It was just an old house. Old houses made noises. But still, the sensation of being watched lingered in the back of my mind. I glanced at the clock on the wall. Almost midnight. I had been meaning to go to bed, but I didn't want to face the silence of the darkened bedroom just yet. I stood up from the couch, stretching out my legs, and decided to make another cup of tea. The kitchen was at the back of the house, past the small hallway that led to the 2 bedrooms and the bathroom. The storm outside seemed to intensify as I moved through the house, the wind rattling the shutters, the trees creaking ominously. I reached the kitchen and turned on the light. It flickered once, then steadied. I grabbed a tea bag from the cupboard and started to fill the kettle with water. I didn't know why, but my nerves were getting the best of me tonight. My skin prickled, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It felt like someone else was in the house, someone standing just out of sight, waiting for me to notice. I shook my head. It was just my imagination running wild. The storm was probably making everything seem worse. The house was old and the wind was making it creak and moan. Nothing more to it. I set the kettle on the stove and turned back toward the living room. That was when I saw it. A shadow. It was quick, just a flash at the edge of my vision. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment I thought it was just the flickering light from the kitchen, but as I turned toward the hallway, I saw it again, a shadow moving across the wall. It was a silhouette, tall and thin, too large to be a trick of the light. My breath caught in my throat and I felt a chill spread through my body. The figure was standing in the hallway, just outside the living room, but it wasn't moving. I stood there, frozen, staring at the spot where the shadow had been. I told myself it was just the storm playing tricks on me. The house was full of creaks and groans, and the shifting light from the storm could easily create illusions. But then I heard something, a soft tapping sound coming from the hallway. I stiffened. The noise was too distinct, too deliberate. It was as if someone was tapping their fingers on the wall, slowly and methodically. The hairs on my neck stood up, and I slowly backed away from the doorway, my heart racing. The tap, tap, tap grew louder, more urgent, echoing through the silent house. I glanced toward the kitchen, where the kettle was just beginning to boil. The sound of the rain outside seemed to fade into the background, and all I could hear now was the tapping, growing louder by the second. It sounded closer, too, as if whatever was making the noise was moving toward me. I was too scared to move, too scared to even breathe. My pulse hammered in my ears, and my hands felt clammy. Slowly, I edged toward the hallway, my eyes darting between the dark living room and the hallway, now shrouded in shadows. And then, I saw it. The figure was standing at the end of the hallway, directly in front of the bedroom doors. It was tall, almost impossibly tall, and thin, its features obscured by the darkness. The figure had no face, just a blur where a face should be, like a shadow or a trick of the light. Its arms were unnaturally long, hanging by its sides as it stood motionless. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. The air around me seemed to thicken, the coldness sinking into my skin. I was trapped, frozen in place, as the figure began to slowly, deliberately move toward me. Its steps were soundless, its body moving with a strange, fluid grace that made my stomach churn. The tap, tap, tap of its fingers on the walls continued, and I couldn't take it anymore. I screamed, the sound rushing out of me in a burst of panic, and I bolted toward the front door. I didn't care if it was locked. I didn't care if the storm was still raging outside. I needed to get out. I needed to escape. As I reached for the door, the light flickered again, and I heard the sound of footsteps, heavier now, behind me. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I wrenched the door open, the cold wind and rain slamming into me, and I ran out into the storm without a second thought. The rain soaked through my clothes instantly, but I didn't care. I ran and ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps until I reached the edge of the property. I looked back at the house, expecting to see the figure standing at the door, watching me, but it was gone. The house stood silent, as if nothing had happened. I don't remember how long I stayed out there in the storm, but eventually I found my way back to the front porch. My heart was still pounding, but the figure was gone, and the house was as silent as ever. I didn't go back inside that night. I spent hours sitting on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the house. I kept hoping I was imagining it, that it was all just a trick of the light, a product of my exhaustion and the storm. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The figure in the hallway was real. The tapping was real. And when I finally went back inside the next morning, the house was just as I had left it. The floor creaked under my feet, the wind howled through the trees, and the storm had passed. But something had changed. The air was heavier now, thick with a presence I couldn't ignore. I don't live in that house anymore. I couldn't. No matter how much I wanted to believe that it was just my mind playing tricks on me, I knew deep down that someone had been there with me that night. And they're still there, waiting for the next person who dares to stay alone on a rainy night. Story, the end.
Story number 11.
The storm had been going on for hours, the rain crashing against the windows of my small house on the edge of town. The wind was so strong it rattled the panes, sending chills down my spine every time it howled through the trees outside. I had always been someone who loved storms, finding comfort in the rhythm of rain and the distant rumble of thunder. But tonight it was different. The atmosphere felt heavier, as though something wasn't quite right. It was a late Friday evening, and I had planned to spend the night alone, unwinding after a long week. My house, an old 2-story building, had always given me a sense of peace, even with its creaking floors and musty smell. The walls, adorned with faded wallpaper, seemed to have a life of their own, a presence that felt like it had been there long before I arrived. I was sitting on the couch, wrapped in a blanket with a cup of tea in my hands, when I first noticed the odd feeling in the air. It wasn't cold, but there was a subtle chill that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I tried to shake it off, focusing on the book in my lap, but every few minutes my eyes would wander to the hallway. The house felt wrong somehow, like it was alive, breathing, watching me. I had lived in this house for a little over a year, and though I had grown used to the strange sounds of creaky floors and settling wood, tonight felt different. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. At first, I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but as the minutes passed, the sensation grew stronger. I glanced toward the hallway again, my heart skipping a beat when I saw the door at the end of the hall slowly creak open, though there was no wind. I blinked, thinking it was just the wind, but the door remained open, just a crack, as though someone had deliberately pushed it. The feeling in the air grew heavier, and I set my cup down, the warmth of the tea forgotten. I stood up slowly, my feet barely making a sound on the hardwood floors. My mind was racing as I made my way toward the hallway, my pulse quickening with every step. The house seemed too quiet now, the only noise coming from the relentless rain outside. As I reached the hallway, I could feel my breath catch in my throat. The door at the end of the hall was still open, sprawled just wide enough for me to see the darkness beyond it. The room beyond the door was my guest room, a small, sparsely furnished space that hadn't been used in weeks. I didn't remember leaving the door open, but my mind struggled to recall if I had. I approached cautiously, my every step echoing in the silence. The air was thick with tension, and a cold draft seemed to roll from the room, sending a shiver down my spine. My hand hovered near the door handle, and I hesitated for a moment before pushing it open the rest of the way. The room was empty, just as I had expected, with the only furniture being a single bed, a dresser, and an old armchair in the corner. But as I stepped inside, I felt a sudden weight in the air, as though the room itself was holding its breath. The temperature had dropped, the air turning icy cold against my skin. I looked around, my eyes searching for any sign of disturbance. The bed was undisturbed, the sheets neatly tucked in. The dresser doors were shut tightly, the room as quiet and still as it had always been. But something about it felt wrong. The shadows seemed deeper in here, darker than they should have been, and the corners of the room felt like they were closing in on me. I backed out of the room slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. As I turned to leave, I heard something faint, almost inaudible, a soft scraping sound, like something dragging along the floor. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It came again, a low scraping, then a soft thud, as if something had fallen. I stood there, frozen, trying to convince myself that it was just the house settling, the wind, anything but what I was starting to dread. But the scraping noise continued, now followed by a low, faint whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, soft, insistent, and pleading. I rushed back to the living room, my heart racing as I tried to calm my breathing. The house was still, the silence now unbearable. I grabbed my phone from the coffee table, intending to call someone, anyone, but my hands were trembling too much to unlock it. My mind was racing with possibilities. Was it the wind? Was it the house settling? Or was something else here with me? I stood there, staring at my phone, trying to steady my nerves when I heard it again. The whisper, faint but clear this time. It was coming from upstairs. I froze. I hadn't heard anyone come in, no doors had opened, no one was supposed to be here. I was alone. The whisper came again, this time louder, clearer. Help me. The words sent a wave of cold fear over me, and I immediately rushed toward the stairs, my breath shallow. I had to see what it was. I had to know. The stairs creaked beneath my feet as I ascended, each step seeming to echo in the oppressive silence. At the top of the stairs, I hesitated for a moment, my mind screaming at me to turn back, but I couldn't. The whisper was there again, beckoning me forward, calling my name in a soft, sorrowful tone. I reached the top of the stairs and looked down the hallway toward the two bedrooms at the end. The one on the left was mine, the other, the guest room. The door was shut now, but I could still feel the cold draft creeping out from underneath it as though something was hiding inside, waiting for me. I walked toward it, my heart pounding in my chest. The closer I got, the more I could feel the presence, like something was just beyond the door, watching me. I reached for the handle, my fingers shaking, and turned it slowly. The door swung open with an eerie creak, revealing the darkness inside. I could see nothing, the room shrouded in shadows, but as my eyes adjusted, I saw something on the floor, a faint shape, barely visible in the low light. I stepped inside, my heart pounding in my chest. The air in the room was freezing, the cold pressing against me like a weight. As I moved closer to the shape on the floor, my stomach twisted in fear. It was a small object, a doll, lying on its side in the middle of the room. It was an old-fashioned doll with porcelain skin and glassy eyes that seemed to stare directly at me. I couldn't breathe. My mind was racing, and I felt a chill run down my spine as I looked at the doll. There was something wrong about it. It looked like it had been placed deliberately, its head tilted slightly to one side, as though it was looking at me. Then, as if it were responding to my thoughts, the doll's head shifted. Just a little. I stumbled back, gasping for air, and the doll's eyes seemed to follow me. The room felt suffocating, the walls closing in on me as the whispering began again, louder now, more frantic. Help me. Please. The voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, from inside the walls, from beneath the floorboards, from the very air itself. It was so close, so real, that I could almost feel it breathing down my neck. I backed away from the doll, my heart hammering in my chest, but I couldn't stop myself from looking back at it. And that's when I saw it. A faint outline in the corner of the room, a shadow that wasn't quite right. It was as though the darkness had taken on a shape, a form that was watching me. I couldn't make out the details, but I knew it was there. I could feel its presence, feel its coldness pressing against me. Leave. The whisper came again, but this time it was different. It was an order, not a plea. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and fled from the room, slamming the door behind me. My breath was ragged, my legs weak beneath me as I ran down the hallway toward the stairs. I couldn't get out fast enough, the coldness of the house chasing me, wrapping itself around me like a suffocating blanket. I reached the front door, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the lock. The whispering was still there, louder now, almost deafening. Leave before it's too late. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. With one final push, the door opened, and I stumbled out into the rain, gasping for breath. The storm was still raging, but I didn't care. I had to get away from that house, from whatever was inside. I didn't return to the house that night, and I never went back after that. The house remains abandoned, just like the whispers that still haunt me, fill me when the rain falls. I don't know what happened that night, but I know one thing for sure. Some places are not meant to be lived in. Some houses are better left alone. Story, the end.
Story number 12.
The rain beat steadily against the windows, a constant drumming that set the tone for the night. The wind howled through the trees outside, and I could feel the chill of the storm creeping into the house despite the heat coming from the radiator. It was late, much later than I realized, and I was still alone in the house. I had recently moved into this old two-story home on the edge of town. It had always been a dream of mine to live somewhere isolated, a house where I could think, write, and find some peace. The old cottage was charming despite its age. It had creaky wooden floors, ivy-covered walls, and an ancient fireplace that added to its cozy atmosphere. I loved the quiet most of the time, but tonight the silence felt different. I had spent the day settling in, unpacking boxes, and getting acquainted with the house. The sun had long set, and now the house seemed to settle into its own rhythm. The wind outside howled more fiercely, and the house groaned with it. I had just finished reading a book, the last of my things unpacked, when I decided to call it a night. I turned off the lights and made my way upstairs to bed. The stairwell creaked as I ascended, the sound echoing in the otherwise still house. I passed the old painting that hung on the landing, a portrait of an unfamiliar woman. The eyes in the painting always seemed to follow me, no matter where I stood. I had never liked it, but it was an old family heirloom, so I left it where it was. As I reached the top of the stairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I paused in the hallway, listening. The wind outside was louder now, and the rain seemed to be coming down harder. But there was something else, something subtle that gnawed at the edges of my mind. The house was silent, too silent. I shook off the feeling, telling myself it was just the storm playing tricks on my mind, and continued to my bedroom. The bed was warm and inviting, and I pulled the blankets over myself, grateful for the shelter from the storm. But even as I closed my eyes, I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't alone in the house. The feeling was too distinct, too real. I tried to push it away, but it clung to me, wrapping around my chest like a vice. It wasn't long before I drifted off to sleep. I had the sound of the storm outside lulling me into unconsciousness. But then I woke up. It was the middle of the night, or at least I assumed it was. The clock on the bedside table showed that it was just past 2 a.m. I had been dreaming, but the dream slipped away as quickly as I awoke. I sat up in bed, feeling a strange unease settle over me. The air felt colder than usual, and I pulled the blanket tighter around myself, trying to ward off the chill. That's when I heard it. A soft, barely audible sound, like footsteps. The creak of the wooden floors below. It was faint, but unmistakable. Something, was walking through the house. I held my breath, straining to hear. The footsteps grew louder, closer, moving down the hallway toward my bedroom. My heart pounded in my chest as I lay there, frozen under the covers, unable to move. The sound continued, growing nearer with each passing moment. Whoever or whatever was walking through the house was getting closer, and they were heading straight for my room. I didn't dare move, not wanting to make a sound. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation for what I was hearing. Maybe it was just the house settling, the old floorboards creaking under the weight of the storm outside, but the footsteps were too deliberate, too consistent to be the wind or the house settling. They were human. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my breath shallow as I waited for whatever it was to reach my door. The footsteps stopped just outside the room, and for a moment, everything was completely still. I dared not breathe, too afraid of what might happen next. Then, just as suddenly as they had started, the footsteps turned, retreating down the hall. I waited for what felt like an eternity, listening for any other signs of movement. But there was nothing. No more footsteps, no creaking, no sound at all. I finally gathered the courage to get out of bed. My body trembled with fear, my legs weak as I stood and walked cautiously to the door. I opened it slowly, peering out into the dimly lit hallway. Everything was still. The house was silent once again, save for the distant sound of the rain. I stepped into the hallway, my feet barely making a sound on the old floorboards. The house felt colder now, the air thick with an unnatural chill. I glanced around, my eyes darting from one corner to the next, half expecting to see someone standing there watching me. But the hallway was empty. I walked down the hallway to the staircase, my footsteps echoing in the quiet. When I reached the stairs, I paused, looking down into the darkness below. The house seemed even quieter now, the only sound the rain slapping against the windows. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. Something had been in the house with me. There was no doubt about it. But I couldn't explain what it was or why it was here. I hesitated for a moment before deciding to investigate. I knew it was foolish, but I had to know what was going on. I made my way down the stairs, my feet barely making a sound on the old wood. The house seemed to groan in protest, as if it was warning me to stop. I reached the bottom of the stairs and looked around. The living room was bathed in shadow, the only light coming from the flickering lamp by the window. The rain lashed against the glass and the wind rattled the shutters. I walked further into the room, my eyes scanning every corner. And then I saw it. A figure, a shadow. It was standing by the window, facing the glass as if it were looking outside. I froze. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, with long, thin limbs and a thin, gaunt body. It was shrouded in darkness, its features indistinct and impossible to make out. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge my presence. It simply stood there, motionless. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. I was paralyzed, unable to tear my eyes away from the figure. It was as if I was trapped in a dream, unable to wake up. The storm outside intensified, and the sound of the wind howling filled the room. Suddenly, the figure turned toward me, its face still obscured by the darkness. I could feel its gaze on me, though I couldn't see its eyes. It took a step toward me, and then another. I stumbled backward, my feet tangling in the rug as I tried to escape, but there was no way out. The figure was moving closer, its long, bony arms reaching toward me. Just as it was about to touch me, I woke up. My heart was racing, my body drenched in sweat. I was back in my bed, the room dark and still. I sat up, my chest heaving as I tried to calm my breathing. The storm raged outside, but the house was silent now. I looked around the room, half expecting to see the figure standing in the corner, but it was gone. There was nothing there. I had been dreaming. It had to have been a nightmare. I had fallen asleep, and the storm had gotten to me. I was just imagining things. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. The feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. The house still felt cold and empty, but there was something else. A presence. Lingering just beyond my perception, something that wasn't there before. I knew that whatever it was, it hadn't left. Story the end.
Story number 13.
The rain had been relentless. A steady drum of water against the windows, punctuated by the occasional rumble of thunder. It had been one of those storms that seemed to stretch on forever, the kind that makes the night feel unnaturally long. The sound of the rain always comforted me, normally. But tonight, alone in my old apartment on the edge of town, it felt different. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, like the house was holding its breath, waiting for something. I had just moved in a few months ago. The apartment was small, but cozy, tucked away in a quiet building that was more aged than charming. It had a history, sure. What place didn't? The walls were thin, the floors creaky, and the windows didn't seal quite right, but it had a kind of eerie charm. When I'd first walked through it, I'd felt a strange pull, as if the apartment had chosen me rather than the other way around. A bit odd, but I was never one to turn down a good deal, and the rent was more than affordable. The building itself had been around for decades. I'd heard rumors from neighbors about things that had happened long ago, disappearances, strange noises, that kind of thing. People were often quick to dismiss it as nothing more than the building settling or people's overactive imaginations. After all, there was nothing definitive about any of the stories, just whispers, half-told tales. But tonight, the atmosphere was heavier than I had ever felt before. I was sitting on the couch, curled up under a blanket with a cup of tea in my hands, trying to distract myself with a book. But my eyes kept wandering to the clock, noting the time. 2:38 a.m. I hadn't been able to sleep. Not really. It wasn't the storm that was keeping me awake. No, something else lingered in the shadows of my mind. The building had its quirks. I'd noticed during the past few weeks that certain things didn't seem to add up. Sometimes, doors I could have sworn were shut were open when I returned home. Items on the shelves would be slightly moved, though I never remembered touching them. At first, I wrote it off as just being forgetful or tired. After all, who doesn't misplace things or forget to shut doors now and then? But tonight, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The air felt colder than usual. The faintest of drafts made the hair on my neck stand on end, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally far across the room. I could feel them, even though I told myself it was just my imagination. A sudden noise interrupted my thoughts, a soft scraping sound coming from the hallway. It was faint, almost imperceptible, like something or someone was slowly dragging their feet across the wooden floor. My stomach twisted into a knot. The noise was so faint that I questioned if I'd imagined it, but I couldn't shake the unease settling over me. The old apartment building creaked and groaned all the time, but this felt different. I set my tea down on the coffee table and stood up, my feet light against the floor, trying to make as little noise as possible. I moved toward the hallway slowly, my breath shallow. The light from the living room barely reached the end of the hall. The shadows there seemed to dance with the flickering of the light bulb, casting strange, elongated shapes on the walls. As I stepped closer, I froze. The bathroom door at the end of the hallway, which I had clearly remembered closing earlier, was slightly ajar. Just a crack, but enough to make the air feel heavier. The scraping sound had stopped. I could hear nothing now except the pounding of my own heartbeat in my ears. I swallowed hard, fighting the instinct to turn and run. It was just the storm, I told myself. The wind was probably causing the house to settle, making the noises I heard. But there was something so unmistakably eerie about the way the door was ajar. My hands trembling, I approached the bathroom door. I reached for the handle and pushed it open, the hinges creaking as the door moved slowly. My eyes scanned the small room, expecting to find nothing but the same bathroom I had used earlier that evening. But the moment the door opened fully, I felt it. Something was off. The room was freezing cold, colder than the rest of the apartment, and I could see my breath in the air, misting in front of me. The light in the bathroom flickered above, casting eerie shadows on the tiles. Everything seemed still. There, in the center of the room, was the source of the cold, a porcelain figure, a small doll placed carefully on the edge of the sink. It wasn't there when I had last used the bathroom. I was sure of it. I took a step toward the doll, my pulse quickening. It was old, its face cracked, the glass eyes staring at me blankly. Its clothes were worn and faded, a little girl's dress from decades ago. I reached out to touch it, and just as my fingers brushed its porcelain cheek, I heard a whisper. "Leave." I recoiled, stumbling back, my heart racing. I was sure I had heard it, clear as day. A voice, faint and soft, but unmistakable. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the storm. I stood frozen in place, unable to speak, unable to move. The bathroom door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. I jumped, the sudden noise cutting through the silence of the apartment like a knife. My breath came in quick gasps as I turned and ran back to the living room, my feet barely touching the floor as I hurried toward the front door. But as I reached the entrance, something stopped me. The air felt thick, almost suffocating. The shadows seemed to move, swirling around me. I could feel them pressing in, surrounding me. The rain outside had picked up again, but it was no longer comforting. It was an ominous sound, like a distant warning. And then from the hallway I heard it again, the scraping noise. Louder this time. Closer. I turned to face the source of the sound, my breath coming in short gasps. From the corner of my eye, I saw it, something moving in the shadows. A figure, tall and thin, moving toward me with a slow, deliberate pace. It was hard to make out details, but I could see its outline clearly. Its movement was jerky, unnatural, as though it was struggling to stay upright. I felt a chill run down my spine. It was standing at the edge of the hallway, just outside the living room. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its gaze on me. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it wasn't human. Without thinking, I bolted for the door. My hand fumbled with the lock, my fingers slick with sweat. The shadows seemed to follow me, creeping along the floor and up the walls, moving in time with my panic. I finally managed to unlock the door and burst outside into the pouring rain. I didn't stop running. I didn't even look back. My only thought was to get away, to leave the apartment and whatever was haunting it behind. Hours later, when the storm had passed and the rain had finally stopped, I stood across the street from the building, staring at the apartment's windows. The lights were out and everything looked calm, peaceful even. But I knew better. I knew what I had felt, what I had seen, and I knew I couldn't go back. I never returned to that apartment. I found a new place to live in the city, far away from the whispers, the shadows, and the cold presence that had followed me there. But even now, sometimes when it's raining outside and I'm alone, I hear it, the faintest whisper in the wind. Leave. Story the end.
Story number 14.
The wind howled against the old cabin walls, rattling the loose window panes like skeletal fingers tapping at the glass. The rain fell in steady sheets, drumming against the roof in a relentless rhythm. Daniel sat alone by the dim glow of the fireplace, his hands wrapped around a cup of black coffee, the steam curling up like ghostly tendrils. It had been years since he last visited his late grandfather's cabin. Nestled deep within the Appalachian woods, the place was isolated, no phone signal, no neighbors for miles, just the thick forest surrounding him on all sides. The perfect retreat from the noise of his life in the city. At least that's what he had told himself. But now, with the storm raging outside and the cabin creaking as if something unseen was shifting within its walls, he wasn't so sure. Daniel had spent the day exploring the area, reminiscing about the summers he had spent here as a child. He had been warned never to stray too far from the property line, though no one ever told him why. Some things are best left alone, his grandfather had always said, his voice grave. Back then, he had thought it was just an old man's paranoia. Now, he wasn't so certain. A sudden gust of wind forced the door to the porch open with a bang. Daniel jumped, nearly spilling his coffee. He set the cup down and moved to shut the door, but as he did, he hesitated. Beyond the porch, through the rain-soaked mist, something stood at the tree line. A figure. At first he thought it was just a trick of the storm, shadows playing tricks on his mind. But then it moved, slowly, purposefully. Daniel's breath hitched as he gripped the doorknob tighter. The figure was tall, its posture unnatural, limbs too long, as if they had been stretched by unseen hands. He couldn't see its face, only the dark outline of its form against the rain. Then it stepped forward. Daniel slammed the door shut, locked it, and backed away. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat a hammer against his ribs. He tried to convince himself it was nothing, just an animal, a figment of his imagination, fueled by exhaustion and the eerie solitude of the cabin. But then came the knock. Soft at first, almost polite. Then louder, a steady, insistent rhythm. His stomach turned to ice. No one should be here. No one knew he was here. The knock came again, and with it, a whisper, so faint he could barely make it out over the storm. "Let me in." Daniel's skin prickled with cold terror. The voice was wrong. It was distorted, stretched, as if spoken by something that had never learned how to shape human words correctly. His mind raced. He backed toward the fireplace, grabbing the iron poker with trembling hands. The knocking stopped. Silence. Then the floorboards creaked behind him. Daniel whirled around, swinging the poker wildly, but there was nothing there. Just the empty cabin, dimly lit by the flickering fire. The wind shrieked outside, shaking the walls. The old wooden beams groaned under the pressure, and for a moment he thought he saw something move in the reflection of the window. A shadow. A face with hollow eyes. His breath hitched, and he stumbled back, knocking over the chair by the fire. The embers scattered, a few landing on the rug, burning tiny holes into the fabric he barely noticed. He wasn't alone. The whisper came again, closer this time. "Let me in." Daniel spun, but the cabin was empty, yet the air felt wrong, heavy, like something unseen was pressing down on him. Then he heard it, a scratching sound. It was coming from under the floor, a deep, slow scrape like nails dragging across wood. His grandfather's warnings echoed in his mind. Some things are best left alone. The scratching turned into a thudding. Someone was beneath the cabin. He dropped the poker and scrambled for his phone. No signal, no way to call for help. Then, silence. The storm continued to rage outside, but the knocking, the scratching, it was gone. Daniel stood there, breathless, his pulse hammering in his ears. Maybe it was his imagination. Maybe the storm was messing with his senses. Then the door creaked open. Not the front door, the cellar door. The one that led to the old root cellar beneath the cabin. Daniel's throat closed in fear. The air from the open doorway was ice cold, and from the darkness below he heard breathing, shallow, wet, not human. He didn't wait to see what emerged. He ran, bolting through the front door into the freezing rain. He didn't stop until he was deep in the woods, far from the cabin, far from whatever had been waiting beneath the floor. He never returned. But sometimes in the dead of night, when the rain pounds against his city apartment windows, he swears he still hears it. The knocking, the whisper. Let me in. Story the end.